This is Real Lemon, and I am here with Ink, here to record another episode of our still unnamed podcast.
Untitled Smash Bracket Podcast. Welcome, by the way.
We're going to be locked into that name forever because we gave it in 2 episodes, and
the Untitled Smash Bracket. That's so stupid.
I know. That's what happened to the Untitled Goose Game, though.
Oh, really?
Yeah. It was literally meant to have a title at some point, I think. Also, Project Octopath Traveler. That
was supposed to be a temporary?
Yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, it's a very common thing, and you've doomed us to it.
Well, oh boy.
Today, we are going to be talking about the general rules and philosophy of Smash Bracket. We have an article written up about this, and a very old video, and decided that just having a conversation between Ink and myself would be a really good way to get a more updated view out there that we could later condense into something more brief.
Like a consumable video. Because the one we have right now isn't super representative of where we're at anymore. It was something I threw together pretty quickly so we had something we could demonstrate for the original Kickstarter. And while it does better than nothing, there's also a few things that are kind of confusing or misleading in it.
It also wasn't really written with the intention to be understood by anyone with any sort of existing notion of how versus battles work. Ink and I just weren't involved in that scene enough to understand how to communicate our ideas clearly. And so since then we've gotten a lot more explicit about how we treat the series, and put things together in a more understandable way. So yeah, with that, I guess I'll just kind of walk us through the article that I've got written, talking about the big points we have. I'm not going to read it, but more just talk about some of the key elements and our thoughts on them.
Well, I think it's worth, real fast, having a quick interjection of why does this video even exist? Like, you don't see something like this for Death Battle or other places. And there's kind of this notion that we have a really long, complicated rule set. And
I'm sure this hour-long podcast or whatever it'll be will help dispel that
but
notion.
It's really not the case. Like, there's also this perception that we just do it as a gimmick to lowball characters and be unique. But Smash Bracket and Super Smackdown and any sort of involvement we have in versus discussions, it just makes the most sense with the way our minds work to measure characters in this way. We don't do it because we want to have something unique. It's just genuinely how we feel is the most accurate way to measure a character. That'll get you the best results while negating bias or inconsistencies or things like that.
Yeah, the best way, I think, to boil it down is that we want to treat characters in a way that puts a high emphasis on what they have shown themselves, and we want to be able to consistently treat characters between franchises and let our bias influence things as little as possible. And I guess also we want to make sure that we, apply logic and critical thinking to things and make sure that when we describe what a character is doing, that we're actually talking about what has happened instead of what has
trying to connect
claimed.
the dots with things that aren't necessarily there.
Yeah. And really that's what it all boils down to. It's just the reason why we have such long discussions is because that way of thinking that Ink and I have just isn't something that is I don't want to say that it's uncommon or hard for people to comprehend, but I do think that it's really counterintuitive to people who are used to different formats. And because we value consistency and clarity, we end up with really long discussions and lots of examples and breaking things down to pretty minute details so that we can then reference that and make sure that we're being consistent as a series.
And it wasn't even always going to be like this. I remember with our very first episode, Link versus Ridley, that was still Real Lemon and I just unofficially kind of working together on the Ink Thinks channel. And I had the Death Battle rule set pulled open, and I was looking through their stuff, and I was like, wait, they have Link rolling at the speed of light here. Something feels wrong. And there was this disconnect between these characters that I've known and loved for years, loved playing as them, and then feeling like I was describing a totally different character that doesn't even exist.
I'm actually pretty sure a big motivator for us to try and establish ourselves as treating characters differently was looking at Death Battle and how they gave Mario that lightning feat when we see the birds fly.
With the birds. Yeah.
Yeah, I know that has become something of a meme in the community, seeing you crack up about that. But it just, to us, it felt like such an obvious example of he can't be moving at high speeds, because we see, like, demonstrated evidence to the contrary. Whereas a lot of other people will just interpret it and say that those are, like, game mechanics holding it back, or
all those
decisions.
Other things are moving at that speed.
Right, and that's just, it's not what makes sense to us, and we feel like going with that approach makes it really, really easy for our own biases to influence the series.
Which I'm sure if you're part of the Versus community and you do debate under other rule sets, you've noticed plenty of people with biases before that can be very frustrating when you see how they've interpreted something.
And I've noticed tons of people who aren't that way, who make a clear intentional effort to keep their biases out and to try and be very reasonable about their interpretations of characters. So it's not like we think that our rule set is the only way that you could do this well. It's just that I think that this rule set is the only way that we can do this well and be consistent. And that trying to write it out and formalize things in the way that we have is the only way that we can make sure that the channel is consistent and that we can give the fans a way to debate under our rule set if they're interested.
And if we've done our job right, you'll basically be able to tell how we'd interpret any given feat, because you'll have the same stuff that we check ourselves to with every single conversation we have.
Right. So today we're going to be kind of going over a lot of that, just the general philosophies. I've got a lot of articles breaking down more specific points, but this is going to be... My idea when I was writing it is that if you read this article, you would be able to understand enough about our way of thinking and philosophy that you would know how we would interpret anything, even if we haven't, like, made a specific ruling about, say, absolute zero.
Right. Because our rule set is really built around having a way to reflect this philosophy in a consistent way we can apply to battles, but it all reflects it comes back to the way we view things and that mindset and philosophy, to the point that it sometimes takes me aback when people call it a rule set.
Yeah, the article I wrote about this calls it our philosophy, specifically because I feel like rule set is a little too narrow. I'm trying not necessarily to define a specific set of points to follow, but to outline our overall approach in order to let that approach be something that you can use to inform your own decisions or know how we will inform our decisions about things.
Right.
So I've broken this down into 3 pillars that I feel like our philosophy falls under. And that's going to be, the first pillar is feats have to be proven to be valid instead of proven to be invalid. The second one is all feats and characters are subject to real-world logic and physics to as high a degree as is possible. And the third pillar is that we have a hierarchy that we use to determine the importance of feats, and that prioritizes feats that are displayed more than statements. And so those 3 pillars really form the foundation of everything, and everything we're going to be talking about is going to fit into one of those. So to start from the beginning there, feats need to be proven valid instead of invalid. Do you want to speak on that at all, Ink?
Yeah, so really that's just a reflection of where we come from when looking at a feat. A good example would be... I had one. Can you think of a good example to demonstrate this?
Yeah, I think overall, this is one of the more confusing points because people have really different expectations of what this means. I've talked to a lot of people who will say things like, Mario can punch with enough strength to, like, shatter a star. And we will treat that as the default assumption, and in order to discredit that statement, you have to, like, find lots of definitive proof that he can't punch and shatter a star. Whereas for us, we're like, okay, we need to find definitive proof that he can shatter that star.
Right. So rather than the burden of proof being on the person trying to disprove something, it rests on the person making the claim.
This is a really difficult argument for me to find a good way to communicate, because the fact is that everyone thinks that they think this way. And I don't know if our end is the one that's confused or if other people are confused, but what happens is we will make some claim about a character or say that we don't buy into a certain feat, and people will respond to us and say, well, Hitchin's razor, you've got to disprove it. It's not my burden to prove it, which is the opposite of Hitchin's razor.
Hitchin's razor essentially says something that could be claimed without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Right, and it's not a universal truth. I've got a whole article about this as well. It's just a philosophy made to make debates simpler and to prevent them from wasting time.
Right.
But the problem is that a lot of people try and establish their own baseline and opinions, or I guess their own opinions as the baseline. And so they will say that any claim made that contradicts their beliefs is the thing that has to be proven, and their claims don't.
I think it might be good to demonstrate this principle a bit more with an example that we walk through.
Yeah, let me see. I think I've got one here in the article.
While he pulls this up, I will mention that Hitchin's razor, like you said, isn't a universal truth, and there is a counter-philosophy made by other philosophers called, what is it, Newton's flaming laser sword?
It's not necessarily a counter-philosophy as much as it is a more extreme example of it. So Newton's flaming laser sword is the idea that you can't have any belief that isn't... Let's see, I think it's... You can't have a belief if it's not falsifiable. Or rather that it's not worth discussing something that isn't falsifiable. So I could say my favorite color is green, and Newton's flaming laser sword would say that's completely irrelevant to debate because there's no way to prove I'm wrong. And
that comes up, like, when we say this is our favorite rule set, or this is, like, how we like doing things, I'll say, prove it! That's happened several different times.
Yeah, honestly, I feel like I'm more aligned with that belief, but it's not... Like, the reason it's called that is because there's a group of philosophical razors, like Hitchin's razor.
Occam's razor.
Yeah, those are meant to, like, trim the fat off of an argument to make debates go smoother. Hitchin's flaming laser sword is far more than a razor and is meant to just hack things to pieces to reduce it to practically nothing. And it's often brought up as an example of taking things too far. So, yeah, let me take a look here.
Looking at an example for that first point?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got one here, but it's Sonic, which makes me wary.
We'll go into this. Take this argument in isolation. If we say something that isn't how you know Sonic to be, just try to set that aside for the point we're trying to make here. So then,
the argument is Solaris. Solaris is the final enemy of one of the Sonic games, Sonic 06 specifically, and he's stated to be like a god of time and space, to exist beyond all time and space. And so a lot of people will take those statements, those claims about Solaris, and say that because of that, Sonic and Shadow and Silver they have to be able to affect higher dimensional beings. They have to be able to operate outside of our reality and outside of time in order to defeat Solaris. And in order to discredit Solaris, what you would need to do is find irrefutable proof that he isn't the way that those statements have claimed him to be. Whereas, from our perspective, we look at Solaris and we say, okay, what has he been shown to do? And we kind of build up his abilities from there.
Kind of saying you need irrefutable proof that he is what they're claiming to be.
Right. And so we look at Solaris and we see that he seems to have been able to travel through time, though it was a little ambiguous whether that was him or a Chaos Emerald. However, he doesn't have free reign of that because he, like, comes into existence at one point, which can't happen if he was outside of time. Like, if he was truly outside of time, he would exist in all times, always. There would be no progression of his character, no development at all. And so for us, that's enough to say, well, he obviously isn't existing outside of time because it's directly contradicted. So honestly, it's a little up to interpretation whether you say that that's us trying to disprove something, or whether you say that that's us just finding that there isn't enough to prove something. And that's where a lot of this confusion originates, is I've tried to find, like, a simple way to phrase what it is about this approach that makes us come to radically different interpretations, and I'm kind of struggling to find one that is universally understood. But the idea is just that I don't think we've had any statement that we've accepted without proof. And maybe that's what it comes down to. That everything needs a substantial amount of proof in order for us to believe it.
And yeah, and the reason is, it's not because we're massive skeptics, but people and characters are prone to exaggeration or euphemism or saying things in a way that isn't meant to be taken as a literal interpretation. And an example of this in the real world is in older times, like biblical era almost. It was really common for people to use the phrase like the world or the entire world to refer to a small section of people or a small section geographically. And if looking at out of context, that could apply to like literally the entire planet. And that's something that throughout human history has been a recurring element, but is also just kind of a marker of human speech and how we talk, that we don't think through everything we say to be taken literally. And people who write video game character dialogue typically aren't, in theory, they're trying to make their characters sound like believable people rather than exposition dumps that are supposed to be taken word for word, totally literally.
Yeah, not everything is written like it were like a mechanical textbook or something where precision is of extremely great importance. I mean, your example, even today you have people who will say something like, my world got turned upside down because they, like, missed a hair appointment or something. And obviously very metaphorical. And the problem is that with dialogue, when you don't have anything to visually confirm what happens, or at least confirm with a lot more detail, there are so many things about language, any language, that are prone to interpretation. And it's a matter of bias. Another example of that is, again, from Sonic. I've looked into Sonic the most, so I have the most examples with him. But in Sonic Battle, there's a scene where Eggman says that he has destroyed a bunch of stars, in the English translation at least. He fires off a cannon and he's like, look, all of those stars over there are destroyed. And the character next to him goes, no, and is sad.
I liked those stars.
But if you look at the Japanese, the word for stars could also be translated to world. And then suddenly it's a lot less clear whether Eggman has just blown up several solar systems or whether he's blown up a couple of planets. And there are even arguments that it's not even that, and that maybe it's even a smaller realm that he's affected, and there's just not enough context there to say. It's entirely dependent on what you believe, what biases you bring into that discussion, and how you feel like you want to interpret that.
And it gets even more complicated when you mix it with characters who have personalities where they often brag or talk about themselves or even downplay themselves for the opposite side of things.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's a niche example, but there's this anime I watched fairly recently called, What Happens When a Kid from the Dungeon Boonies Goes to the Starter Town? Something like that. It's a terrible, terrible name. The anime wasn't that great either. But the whole concept is that it's this kid from, like, right outside the final boss of a JRPG, and then he goes to the starting town and is absurdly strong, but he thinks he's weak because he's used to, like, endgame enemies. And so he spends the entire show saying things like, I'm the weakest person in existence, while just casually one-punching all of the enemies.
That's really funny.
Yeah, it's hilarious. I mean, I said it was okay. It's nothing amazing, but it is a really fun watch. But, like, clearly, you listen to this guy, and you have his statements saying that he's nothing. He's, like, literally he thinks that he's below, like, squirrels, because where he comes from, squirrels are like 40-foot monsters that devour trees. And then you see all the people around him who are used to literal squirrels who thinks this guy is God, and they're praising him as the strongest guy ever, and they're obviously wrong. And it's just a really good demonstration of this principle of how people just aren't trusted. The statements that they make are prone to their own bias, their own reality that they are a part of, and they can't separate that. Obviously, I don't think everything works just like that show.
Right.
It's just a really good example of the principle.
And people are also bad judges of what they're actually doing or how fast or how strong they are. For example, from a very popular versus debating series, The Office, there's this scene where Michael Scott and the employees went out because they just put in a new speed trap, like a stop sign that'll measure your speed. And they're all taking turns running to see how fast they go, who can rank the highest. And Michael ends up running at the exact same time a truck drives past, and he clocks in at like 45 miles an hour. And he would tell anyone he ran that fast. But yeah, there's just a lot of variables.
And obviously, not every series is prone to the same issues here, and a lot of them take steps to address them and make characters more reliable. But what we're trying to do is have an approach that we can feel confident is as possible to being unbiased across every character.
Right.
Or as unbiased as possible. We can't eliminate bias, certainly. We will make mistakes, but by attempting to remove our interpretation from these feats, by saying that everything has to be proven and that statements don't prove anything on their own, we make it so that that ambiguity is far less tolerated and far less likely to influence the characters based on our perception of them.
Right.
It also kind of ties into power scaling. I've got a video coming out. It'll probably actually be out before this episode.
Yeah, probably.
So hopefully you've seen that and know our rules. But it's the same core approach there, where everything needs to be demonstrated in a measurable way. And if it isn't, then it's just not something that we can use. I say measurable, but I don't necessarily mean like putting a number on it. We just need to be able to like understand the scope of what's happening.
Right. An example is Pikachu has some really crazy feats in terms of his speed. I forget exactly where we had him. At one point we had him at like Mach 10. I don't know if that's where he ended. But
at one point we had him at like Mach 400.
So for this example, let's say we got him at Mach 400. And then later on in the series, he fights a Lucario. And someone could say, well, Lucario fought Pikachu, and Pikachu can go Mach 400, and so Lucario can go Mach 400, or keep up with people who are. But if you measure what Pikachu's doing in that scene, he doesn't move anywhere close to that speed, ever. And so while some people would say, well, you need to disprove that he can move this fast, like he could still be moving faster, we would say the opposite, like we said before, kind of coming from, starting him from zero, saying, why would we say he can move Pikachu's max speed when you can actually measure him here and see how fast he's moving?
Right. And I think that just about covers our first pillar. The next one is that we try to use real-world physics and logic as much as possible. A lot of people take issue with this because we aren't measuring the real world. We are like looking at video games, which are obviously not going to be one-to-one with real life. But our idea is, again, trying to take the ambiguity out of things. By doing calculations and trying to describe things with physics, we get an objective way to compare feats. We understand that it's not like perfectly accurate. We don't necessarily think that we can measure a feat and get the objectively correct amount of energy behind it. But what it does do is gives us a really consistent approach between characters that let us do a better job of like telling which is more powerful than what would happen if we were to just eyeball things. Like, Ink, what do you think is more powerful between, like,
They both weigh a pound.
getting uppercut into the atmosphere versus, like, crushing a 1-inch steel cube in your hand?
I would think that launching someone into the atmosphere would be more impressive, and I would be wrong.
Yeah, so, like, if you crushed a steel cube into powder, that's, like, a ridiculous amount of energy. It's super impressive. And launching people is not very impressive. Basically,
but probably
no matter
more
the
relevant
distance.
for a fight.
Yeah, I mean, you could, like, grab someone's arm and crush it, I guess. But yeah, anyway, the point is, and I didn't do the math on that, so maybe it's like a 2-inch steel cube that you would need to crush. But the point is that a lot of times you'll look at something that a character does and thinks that it's really impressive when it's not. Another one I've seen a lot is like a character walking on the surface of the sun, which sounds insane, and it is fairly insane until you measure the energy levels involved and realize that it's not really that impressive compared to basically anything.
Feats. Yeah.
Part of that's a problem of reducing everything to a measure of energy, because, like, obviously someone living on the surface of the sun isn't going to directly translate to their ability to endure punches. It's just a pretty different thing.
Right.
But at the same time, when you try to see which one is more powerful, that's going to be outclassed by, like, relatively minor things.
In terms of durability, not heat resistance.
Right.
Okay.
I mean, even heat resistance isn't that much. The thing about, to derail a little bit, the thing about heat is that you are limited in how much heat you can absorb. So at some point, it doesn't actually matter how hot the thing next to you is, because you're, like, physically incapable of absorbing.
There's not enough room in your body to absorb.
Yeah, it's complicated, and there are kind of exceptions, but in general, like, something like that is just not going to be as impressive as it seems on the surface. And that's why we do these calculations, is because we would just be super wrong about comparisons without them.
Also, it is impossible to use any measurement anywhere without reflecting to our own world. Because physics, what you would be using to measure, the only thing we have to base that off of is our own universe.
Right. I see a lot of problems arise when we get into what sounds like more complicated physics. Anything above, like, simple measurements. But really, everything from, like, getting a measure of how fast a character is going by looking at how far they move over what amount of time to, like, how much a character weighs. Like, all of it is based on physics. And to do any sort of meaningful comparison between what a character is capable of doing, you have to apply some physics. So what we say is that we will apply that physics. We'll try and use that physics to make things as unambiguous as possible, but that we are limiting the situations where we apply that physics to ones that physics can describe. So, for instance, a lot of times you will see a character shoot a laser. They'll be like, I'm firing a laser blast at my opponent right now, and then they shoot out this little blob of something that glows and moves very slowly through the air. And when there
is not a laser.
Now suddenly everyone is light speed because they called this thing a laser, and it doesn't behave like one.
Which gets into a recurring issue of trying to give the feats of a real-life laser to something that doesn't behave like one.
Right. And that's what we're intending to stop, is we want to be able to apply in physics and describe scenarios, but only when it makes sense. And so for any phenomenon we look at, and especially the more extreme ones, they have to demonstrate certain criteria in order for us to count them. Otherwise, you get into situations where, like, a character creates a hole that is black, and it is treated like a black hole, and now suddenly everyone on the battlefield is, like, infinitely durable because they weren't ripped apart by a black hole.
Right.
Even when it's, like, mildly sucking things in and can't even rip a tree out of the ground.
And people will say, well, that's just a limitation. Like, you can't expect this to behave like an actual black hole. To which my response is, then you can't expect us to give the durability required for an actual black hole.
Right. Like, I don't know. I get what people mean when they try to say that games have limitations and can't show off things the same way that real-life physics could. Like, you're not going to see a game with a character moving at light speed in real time, because that's just not something you could convey. But there are steps you could take to convey intention, to hint towards things without showing them fully in real time. And most importantly, like, it doesn't really matter whether something isn't shown because of a game limitation or whether it's not shown because they're not meant to do that. When we measure what's shown, we're looking at what's shown. So if they're not doing it, we're not going to let them have it.
Right.
But yeah, so that, I mean, that basically applies it, or talks about everything I wanted to bring up here. The only other thing is that sometimes we'll have, like, fictional physics. And in those cases, we do tend to go with what's described in fiction.
Like Minecraft, right?
Minecraft is a good example, but a more common and understandable one is that characters will often move faster than light in fiction, which is just completely impossible in the real world. And, like, trying to apply the real-life consequences of faster-than-light movement to fictional characters is going to get you drastically different interpretations than what is actually presented in the media. And so in that case, we just say, that's not possible in our world, it is in theirs, so we're just going to let them move faster than light and assume that it doesn't have any of the consequences that it would have in our world. There's a lot of things where that happens, like attacks almost never show that they have an equal and opposite force like they would in our world. Mm-hmm. Like, if I were to punch you, my hand would take just as much impact as I delivered to your face.
Right.
But in fiction, that practically never happens. And so we don't treat Newton's third law as being a factor in fiction unless it's shown to exist.
Right.
We'll do that with everything. Minecraft is another good example because it has a very clear, defined set of physics that its world operates under that is very different than our own. Like, gravity is just, it's different, and it's different in a way that we can quantify. Or the way that blocks react to explosions is completely different than how our world treats explosions. Mm-hmm. Stuff like that, we would give precedence to the way that Minecraft handles it, because we can see how their physics system operates. The last thing to talk about is our hierarchy of feats. And we've touched on this a little bit, but what it basically boils down to is that we want to look at what a character has demonstrated, and as a result of that, we give higher weight to like things done in a cutscene or things done in gameplay than we do to statements and lore. Mm-hmm. So that hierarchy is just that we give the most weight to anything shown and demonstrated in a cutscene. Not said in a cutscene, but like something that actually is shown.
Right. And I'll probably have this visual on screen if you're watching this or listening on YouTube, so you can kind of look at it and follow along with us.
Feats demonstrated in gameplay are the next most important. Then statements and lore from inside the game.
Meaning, like, from a character.
Yeah, from a character,
or
the story, or, like, a narrator in the game. Then statements from outside the games, such as, like, director commentary, or creator statements, or, like, a guidebook. Not like an official guidebook, like an Ultimania for Final Fantasy. And then after that is all other canon materials. Out of those, the only things able to actually create feats are feats that have been demonstrated, whether in gameplay or cutscenes. Everything else is going to be supporting those feats at best. So what that means is that it doesn't matter if there's extremely consistent lore and statements saying that a character can do something if we never see them do that. But it can help us understand something that's ambiguous. So if we have really ambiguous feats for like how strong a character is, as far as what they've demonstrated, but then statements clarify that they could lift like 1,000,000 tons, then we could look at their demonstrated feats and say, well, in this instance, he's lifting like some super heavy, dense material, and we don't have a weight, so I guess we could assume that's 1,000,000 tons.
Right.
Something like that. So
we can use those to contextualize what we see, but we're never going to measure stuff that we can't measure or like see happen.
Right. Another good example is like, let's say that a character ran around the world in 10 seconds. But it's not Earth, it's just some world they live on. While we only have what's shown, we would probably use the radius or circumference of the world for that feat.
Our own Earth.
Yeah. But if there was a statement saying that it was like 100 times bigger than Earth, we would use that instead, and that suddenly makes the feat much more impressive.
This is something we ran into with Kirby, is a lot of his feats were dependent on the size of his planet. And there, in theory, was stuff to not use our own Earth's size, although the Kirby planet size is a whole issue.
Yeah, I hate pop stores.
We have a whole video on that, actually, right?
Yeah, on the crew channel, which this should be on, I think.
Yep.
I made a great video about Kirby and his size, and the descent into madness that I endured trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
But I mean, that's basically it. Do you want to go over the other rule set stuff, like the more tournament rules we have? Or did you want to keep it as a discussion?
We should. I don't have the visual in front of me right now.
I got it. We only had a couple.
Yeah, so there's a few things, like in Death Battle, for example, fights have to end in a death. They might allow battlefield removal, I'm not sure. But here there are multiple factors. You could do death, incapacitation, or pacification. Meaning there's some characters like there's a quote I love to take out of context for Star Fox, where Fox says, "Peppy, you can't die," and then use that to argue Peppy is being immortal. Let's say that was true. Peppy couldn't die. If that was the case, he just wouldn't lose a battle that required you to fight to the death. But by allowing for alternative ways of bringing a battle to an end, like pacifying, or like locking them up in chains, or some way to take them out of the fight without killing them, or like throwing them to another planet or something, that allows for a victory condition against characters who can't die in a way that still feels fun, and by not requiring a lethal end to a fight, it helps keep characters feeling in character.
Yeah, one problem, not necessarily that I have with Death Battle, but by the rules of ending in a death, is that you get a lot of really weird situations where, like a character like Aang, for example, wouldn't kill his opponent. But if you have to end the battle in a death, then suddenly you have him doing something that just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And that's usually hand-waved, and it's not a major issue, but it's something that we wanted to try to preserve, is the feeling and character of how people act.
Right.
We also treat characters as though they are aware that they're in a fighting tournament, or that they have to win. They're aware of like how they're able to win a fight.
Yeah, and this came up when we were talking about Kirby versus Jigglypuff, and whether it's Kirby or Sephiroth, there's a bunch of characters who wouldn't go all out in a fight unless they had a good reason to. And Kirby, he's super competitive, and knowing that he's in a competition, I think that could be a determining factor for that fight. Whether he would just kind of loaf around or whether he would actually take things seriously. So it just helps us have a consistent standard to bring characters to when talking about their strategy or how they would behave.
It also helps to mitigate some of the problems that come from not bloodlusting characters.
Right.
Because a lot of characters are generally pacifistic or would try to do something other than fight, which is what we want them to do. So having them be aware of what's required here lets us get those characters to a place where we can have more entertaining animations and still feel true to form for the character. And yeah, that's the last point, is that characters do act true to their personalities and morals to the most that we can make that happen, at least. That means that a lot of characters are going to have weaknesses that are character weaknesses. Sephiroth is a really big one for that, where he's just so cocky and sure of himself that he ends up getting killed because of it a lot. Likewise, it's going to be a factor in how dangerous an opponent is right away. You have someone like Sonic, who tends to goof around and have fun while he fights, and someone like Fox, who just goes for the kill right away because he's a mercenary used to just killing things and moving on. And in a lot of battles, that can be a really big determining factor, where one character might be stronger and faster and more durable, but just likes to goof around so much that they end up getting outclassed by someone who is more serious about fighting.
Right.
And treating them this way helps us introduce a new access to these characters and hopefully present them in a more interesting light for debates.
Yeah. And I think it helps it feel closer to the actual characters and how they would fight if they actually met.
Yeah. But, I mean, that's it. That's our rules.
Yep. We have a few further breakdowns for specific rules, like how we interpret black holes or light speed, or things like that. Where can people find those if they're interested? Assuming they're not already posted on this channel in the rules playlist.
We should, probably in the link to this video, we'll have a link to my Medium page where I write the breakdowns of these rules. I'm probably going to be transitioning away from articles to videos primarily, since that's what people like more. And they'll actually watch videos. So subscribe to the Crew channel for updates on more stuff. You can also stop in on the Discord, where we have lots of discussions, and you can always ask about how we would interpret something or rule on a general stance.
Yep. And we'll also have that linked in the show description. But yeah, I think that's it for today.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in again. Be sure to leave a review on whatever platform you are listening on, especially if that is iTunes, because they rule the world of podcasts.
Really?
Yeah, they are the only platform that matters. There's a lot of other places to get them, but reviews on iTunes are the way that everything is determined.
Really? That's interesting.
Yeah, so
so help us, please.
Please. Yeah, that's it, though. We will have a name by next time, hopefully.
Hopefully.
If you've got suggestions, that would be a great comment to leave.
Yep. And yeah, we'll see you next time.
Yeah.
Bye.